On the 3rd of March, 2023, the user Veg uploaded a map to the Doomworld forums entitled Myhouse.Wad. At time of writing, they have not posted since. Ostensibly, My House is a simple, personal tribute map to Veg's friend Tom, who passed away some time ago. The map is supposed to be fairly easy, with an average playtime of around 10 minutes, and to begin with, that's exactly what it appears to be. My House is, on the surface, about as standard of a Doom custom map as you can get. It's a pretty basic model, filled with pretty basic enemies, and it's got all the standard tropes and level design elements that you'd expect out of basically any map from the original Doom games. There's a secret cupboard with a free chainsaw, some cheap enemy ambushes, and a standard get the key to unlock the exit structure. But the more you play of My House, the more things start to seem very subtly off. There's this power-up that's only visible from inside the house, and when you pick it up, all the monsters you've killed suddenly respawn in subtly different positions. It slowly becomes apparent that the map has elements that aren't conventionally possible in Doom, like doors swinging open instead of retreating into the wall, and at a certain point, all the animations from your guns change from the classic ones to updated ones without any warning. And once you've explored for long enough, and have gotten nice and distracted by all those subtle bits of weirdness, the exit door to My House disappears, trapping you inside. Bit by bit, and the more you explore, My House gets weirder and weirder. Closets open up into infinite hallways, parts of the map start to get bigger and smaller without you noticing, and the main house warps and shifts into nightmarish alternate versions as the regular Doom music starts to distort and corrupt, leading you to think that all those warnings in the README files about the map being haunted might actually have some truth to them. Soon enough, the map has dropped all pretense. The conventions of map design crumble around you as you wander through non-Euclidean environments, fight enemies that shouldn't be in the game, and watch as the house grows and mutates around you, revealing new rooms and reflections of itself as you plunge deeper and deeper. And yet, even as the rules and expectations of what My House ought to be decay around you, it never fully stops being a Doom mod. You're still fighting enemies and collecting health and ammo, and strangely, that anchor to something you understand and are familiar with that never quite goes away makes the geometry of the house, the constantly changing rules, and the distressing tricks it pulls on you all the more unnerving. Because they're not just abstract scary things you've never seen before, they're a perversion and a corruption of something you used to understand, twisted into new forms that erode and undermine the feeling of security we get from knowing what the rules of reality are and how things are supposed to work. In case you couldn't guess, I think Myhouse.Wad is fantastic, and something that you should really play for yourself. Trust me, I've really only shown the first 30 minutes of this damn thing, and it is hours long. But I don't just love the mod because it's surprising, scary, and sometimes funny all at the same time. I find My House fascinating because it, and more recent games like it, present an evolution in the way horror games are being made, and might just represent a wider paradigm shift for the medium as a whole. And to understand why, we need to have a little talk about a guy you may have heard of by the name of H.P. Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft was an author most famous for his work on what's been posthumously called the Cthulhu Mythos, a loose series of horror stories that distinguish themselves by not being directly about deadly monsters or dangerous killers, like a lot of works from around Lovecraft's time, but by instead focusing on a more subtle, more unsettling brand of horror. The scares in Lovecraft's work come not from danger or disgust, but from this pervasive sense of uncertainty that seems to gnaw at your subconscious, making the characters, and also you, question what we assume to be fundamental truths about reality. Lovecraft's works feature themes of people getting mutated and disfigured into forms that are distinctly human and yet also monstrous, alien cultures and societies that show just how weak and insignificant humans really are, and of our perception of the world being a comforting lie that hides a far more complex universe. All stuff that breaks down fundamental assumptions the characters have about the world and their place in it, usually causing them to go crazy as a result. What can I say? Most of his stories end the same way. Lovecraft's personal brand of what he would call cosmic horror has been incredibly influential, in spite of the fact that he was, to be honest, not that great of a writer on a craft level and was kind of an S-tier racist. For example, David Lynch's Twin Peaks practically creaks under the weight of powerful, unseen forces that cause you to question the meanings of every single line and shot. Junji Ito's manga centers around monstrous yet distinctly human horrors that are made all the scarier because of their familiarity, and the true fear in Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation comes from the creeping realization that the weird mutations and aberrations caused by Area X aren't random, but serve some unknowable higher purpose beyond the minds of humanity. Unfortunately though, games have never been quite as successful as other mediums when it comes to adapting or being inspired by Lovecraft. Don't get me wrong, Lovecraft's sticky little fingerprints are all over gaming culture, from Lovecraftian baddies in Dungeons & Dragons and the ever-popular Call of Cthulhu tabletop RPG, to Lovecraftian settings and monsters being key fixtures of some foundational shooters like Half-Life and Quake. But in my opinion, games have never quite been able to tap into the Lovecraftian feeling of unease and paranoia in the same way as the real thing. Stuff like the Sinking City or the Call of Cthulhu video game have got the fishmen and the tentacles and the themes of insanity, but the emotional core, that feeling of dread that makes you doubt everything, terrified that you no longer understand anything, that is always missing. And it's usually replaced by more obvious, more direct forms of horror, or just using Lovecraft as more of an aesthetic. It wasn't until I played My House that I became aware of a rising trend of titles that do Lovecraft right, where his immortal, spooky essence is alive and well, and in many cases, these games achieve this by deliberately eschewing the surface level Lovecraftian elements of outer gods and cyclopean architecture, and instead focus on the thing that makes cosmic horror work. And that is what most people would call the uncanny. The uncanny is a term that was coined by discredited psychologist and big fan of cocaine Sigmund Freud, who originally called it das Unheimlich, or unhomely, and basically, it references that upsetting, disconcerting and uncomfortable middle ground between something familiar and something totally alien that just sort of puts us on edge. The uncanny stems from objects, creatures and places that we can sort of understand, or kind of get our heads around, but also in some key way defy the way we expect things to look or behave, causing us to doubt all of our subconscious assumptions about the world. And it's this fundamental psychology that Lovecraft's work plays off, blending the alien and the mundane into something that's more unsettling and destabilizing than either of the two ever could be alone. It's by truly recognizing the power of uncanny horror and by knowing which underlying assumptions to undermine that games can finally realize their full spooky potential and also maybe reveal some hidden unsettling truths about themselves that we've been ignoring in the process, but I'm getting ahead of myself. One of the easiest ways to see the uncanny at work in games, particularly in newer ones, is through their visual design. You may have noticed a weird swell in the popularity of horror games in particular that deliberately use outdated graphical styles like low poly PS1 stuff or pixel art, stuff that modern games moved away from decades ago and really don't look very good at all by conventional standards, on top of being pretty hard to make. In many cases, however, this is actually a deliberate attempt to heighten a level of uncanny fear. Look at Faith's horrible cutscenes, basically anything by the brilliant Yames, and also whatever's going on in Paratopic. The fact that you can't clearly observe the world and the monsters in it creates, I guess you'd call it a sort of psychic smear that makes even mundane concepts look strange and off-putting and renders monsters all the scarier because they can't be easily understood and put into a nice, convenient visual category right away. You may have heard of a phenomenon by the name of the Uncanny Valley, and that's similar to what's happening here. The Uncanny Valley, not to explain yet another thing, is a theory created by a robotics professor by the name of Masahiro Mori, and it states that there's a sharp drop-off in how appealing we find a character right at the moment it reaches that uncanny zone of being recognisably human, but evidently not one. This is why the vast majority of enemies in horror games take the form of humanoid but distinctly inhuman monsters. Robots, mutants, zombies, etc. Stuff that's kind of difficult to categorize into a nice, straightforward box, and so is inherently unnerving even before they've been presented as a threat. Video games, however, can go a step further. Ambiguity in art style and level of visual clarity can further blur the line between the recognizable and the alien, not just on a conceptual level, but a visual one too. Compare most of the enemies in Resident Evil 4, which are technically zombies, but basically just look like people in need of a dermatologist, to these weird, pixely, difficult to make out monstrosities in, say, World of Horror. The Ganados are well lit, realistic in style, and visually easy to pass, and so register as just regular people to our brains, which in a small but significant way is a source of conceptual security. On the other hand, it's difficult to put your finger on what exactly World of Horror's monsters actually look like at a glance, because the game's primitive, glitchy graphics prevent them from being easily recognizable. As your imagination works overtime to interpret the chunky 1-bit graphics, you're forced to pore over every detail of the eldritch creatures in an attempt to visually pass them. Not only are these weird baddies both monstrously scary and humanly empathetic, they also require some twisting of your brain to even understand, forcing you to drop your defenses in the process. Of course, it's not just the visual design of enemies that can create this uncanny sensation. The look and feel of a game's environments and UI too can be a huge trigger for this stuff. A great example of this would be games that focus on so-called liminal spaces, areas that are ordinarily bright and filled with people that suddenly feel weirdly wrong when you empty them out and turn the lights off. Equally, locations associated with childlike innocence and safety take on an unsettling edge under the right context, as your nostalgia and expectations from childhood clash with a destabilizing sense of danger that twists places you previously considered to be safe and normal. Kitty Horror Show's Anatomy is fantastic at this. It takes place in an environment we're naturally intimately familiar with and casts it in an entirely new light, turning utterly mundane spaces slowly but surely into horrifying reflections of previously comfortable and safe environments, all through clever use of low detail graphics and darkness. Long before the actually supernatural elements start appearing, the juxtaposition between your perception of what a house ought to look like and the uncanny simulacrum of a house you're seeing right now will already have you jumping at shadows and scared out of your mind. It's great. Equally, something like Cruelty Squad's incredibly upsetting and alien user interface can really creep you out even though it's literally designed to help you, simply because it's a perversion of a gameplay element that normally has a very particular look. It's technically, and I use that term very loosely, functional, but the garish and inefficient design stretches our internal definition of what a game UI is supposed to look like way past its breaking point, while also still definitely being one. The same goes for Signalis. The game's constant visual aberrations and distortions mean that you can't even rely on the graphics and interface to tell you what's going on, as cutscenes glitch out, your perspective changes to first person abruptly, and enemies like these Calibri bastards start to cover the screen in visual noise. Rather than being an impartial, reliable depiction of the game, now Signalis' very graphics and interface become a source of uncomfortable ambiguity, with the very things you're seeing being both true and untrue, there and not there in an uncanny juxtaposition. Even beyond the visuals of a game's environment, your spatial relationship to a game's world and the way you navigate through it can also be surprisingly unsettling. The idea that a video game world should conform to the constraints of something approximating reality is an assumption so deeply wrought that we barely even stop to consider it. But that means when games do screw with their world's layout, the results can be dramatic. The tragically abandoned PT/Silent Hills is the undisputed king of this, taking place in a non-Euclidean loop around the same house over and over again, with each loop causing things to deteriorate and change even more. Each go around the house, you can't help but feel your brain try to reject the idea that you'll arrive in the same place as before because it just doesn't mesh with how you expect video game worlds to operate, only for it to be proven wrong yet again as you arrive right here in the corridor, ready to go round again. This sort of destabilization of what we perceive foundational rules of video games to be can even give non-scary games a horror twist. Look at Manifold Garden for example. It's an objectively beautiful game with a fantastic art style, but equally there's just something kinda creepy about its endless repeating world that bumps up against your expectations of how an environment ought to function. This sort of stuff is the core of what Lovecraftian horror and the wider uncanny horror subgenre is getting at. It's not enough for something to simply be weird, it has to in some way challenge the way you perceive the world, operating in ways that expand the limits of your imagination and in the process revealing just how little you actually know. Something truly unknowable can't be a vector for uncanny horror, because it's too alien to really grasp, in the same way that LSD Dream Simulator can't do much more than just be strange and, to be honest, kinda boring. And by the same token, a game that's too familiar can't be uncanny either, because we can easily fit it into our existing worldview and understanding of how things work. Dredge, for example, despite taking heavy Lovecraftian influence and being a very good game, fails at being uncanny horror because all of its spooks operate in ways that are too easy to understand and boil down to nice, simple, objective mechanical interactions, like how these ships are always anglerfish, this big dude always travels in the same very limited path, and these birds only ever attack you when you're crazy and do the same thing every single time. Mechanics that you can easily master, and more importantly, find a sense of stability in learning how to beat. In fact, this is kind of why most games that claim to be Lovecraftian just don't quite work. They fail to really upset your assumptions or use unknown and unexpected elements to build a sense of unease. Sure, the monsters are scary and the concepts can be novel, but it's easy to fit, say, the sinking city's bad guys and environmental weirdness into distinct video gamey categories. This is a bulky melee enemy, that's a static obstacle, this is a hidden door, and being able to reduce this stuff to simple concepts that you can completely understand eliminates their uncanny horror potential no matter how crazy the main character might be going or how many tentacles are on screen. Even most games with insanity mechanics mostly just blur your screen or introduce some weirdo visual effects. It's the horror game equivalent of the Mario Kart blooper. They never actually make you feel insane or question the reality of what you're seeing. The way to get that feeling of disconcerting, unnerving horror across is to have your perception of how games ought to work, that comfortable, safe framework through which you view the world, stretched and warped. Because this stuff forms the bedrock of your understanding of games, if it's taken away, suddenly what you thought was impossible becomes scarily plausible. Stuff like boss fights you're supposed to lose, hidden endings and surprise character deaths in games where that doesn't normally happen, surprise and upset us because they go against those unwritten rules of game design. And titles that know what rules to undermine for the greatest effect can bring a lot of emotional payoff out of relatively small changes. As a quick non-horror aside, this is why Mario Wonder's Wonder Seeds are so effective. They always change elements of Mario that we internally consider to be sacred and fixed, like Mario's dimensions, the game's perspective, and whether water belongs on the ceiling or not. All stuff that we've never really considered was actually flexible the whole time. Part of the insidious and destabilizing effect of the Uncanny Valley is that we often don't recognize what concepts we've latched onto and can find a sense of comfort in until they're taken away. Iron Lung, for example, plays on the implicit assumption that video games, particularly first-person ones, are going to let you explore and see the world for yourself, but instead it traps you in a tiny metal coffin and taunts you from the outside with unknowable spooky hints, creating this amazingly oppressive feeling not just from the ocean of blood above you, but the fact that the game isn't playing by the rules and letting you see what's going on until it's too late. Equally, Resident Evil 2's Mr. X is uniquely scary, because unlike everything else you've encountered up until that point, he can't be killed or even avoided. Mr. X can even chase you through doors, which previously formed impenetrable security barriers that you unconsciously learn to rely on. Seeing Mr. X barge through a door right when you think that you've escaped him is one of the single most terrifying things ever in video games. In my opinion, they've never quite matched it. Even beyond these examples of mechanical uncanniness, some of the best horror games of all go after not a game's systems, but the fabric of their software instead. Games that exploit our inherent fear of glitches, or ones that reach out beyond what we thought were their confines, can be supremely scary because we no longer know what their limits really are. What if a game remembered all the faceless mooks you killed as individuals? What if a game could fuck with your settings and controls independently of you? What if things happening in a game's window wasn't actually the entire game? Simply being forced to consider these ideas is often far scarier than a goblin jumping out at you, because the terrifying unknown is no longer contained within the game, it's within your computer and inside you too. As you may recall, I mentioned that video games are the true successor to Lovecraftian uncanny horror, and I think these kinds of fourth wall busting games illustrate why they're best. Unlike all other narrative mediums, video games are the only ones that are by their nature kind of fundamentally unknowable. You can skip to the end of a movie to see how it ends, a picture isn't going to suddenly change what it's depicting, and while books can certainly stretch our conception of what's possible, such as in the brilliant inspiration for Myhouse.Wad House of Leaves, which has entire plots nestled in footnotes and pages dedicated to single words or phrases, novels still operate using the fundamentally knowable constraints of language. But the nature of games and of digital media at large, on the other hand, is a mutual one. You can't skip through a video game to avoid confronting something because your action is critical to driving the experience forwards. Games can hide hidden details that you may never even encounter, and they even react to your attempts to engage with them. In One Shot and I'm Scared, the games create actual files and in some cases entire executables on your computer that you need to interact with in order to proceed. In Slay the Princess, not only are you going against story convention, but it quickly becomes apparent that the narrator of the game can't be trusted, and you don't have quite as much control as you thought you did. And in the case of the amazing Dans, Mullins and Salvador, their games seem to be literally tearing and falling apart around you as they glitch out, directly reach out through the fourth wall, and alienate you from fundamental gameplay conventions with an intensity that simply isn't possible in other mediums. Even more than that, to the minds of the overwhelming majority of people, the function of games and computing is more or less a complete mystery. While we like to imagine ourselves masters of the digital world, the reality is that we have no idea how it works. Every character you see, world you explore, and mechanic you interact with in the game is the product of millions upon millions of lines of instructions written in codes that most of us don't know, which are then translated into vastly more ancient and arcane languages like assembly that not even the people that make games fully understand. And that is just an intermediary to communicate with the magic rock at the heart of every computer that we inscribed magic runes on, something that warps and changes in tiny ways billions of times a second to change the flow of electrons in such a way that you pressing A makes Mario jump. Computers are so complicated so as to be fundamentally unknowable on a mechanical level, and so we're caught in this weird relationship where we both own and control our computers, but are equally, utterly at the mercy of their incredible power and complexity. And it's games that reveal just how little we know about the under-the-hood function of our favourite titles through tricks and subversions that expose this uncomfortable, uncanny relationship. In essence, all computers are, in a small but significant way, eldritch artifacts, defying perception, dreaming of impossible worlds, and operating under their own unfathomable logic that we have no true way of really knowing. Something that would have no doubt scared Lovecraft to death. I think that's why video gaming culture has always had a fascination with haunted games or sentient glitches or hidden eldritch secrets in innocuous places. Because while the like of Sonic.exe isn't real, it lays bare the hidden anxiety that we're not fully in control of technology, we're just sort of trying to steer it. And as computers have only gotten more and more powerful, and as more and more of our lives have become governed by them, so too has the uncanny potential of the medium only expanded. We've got uncanny horror games about social media, artificial intelligence, surveillance states, all real-life concerns, driven fundamentally by our uncanny relationship with technology. And really, you can't get much more Lovecraft than a fear of a world you aren't quite able to understand anymore. As supernatural as the guy's stories may have been, they ultimately drew from his real-life fears. Try reading The Shadows over Innsmouth sometime and tell me that it's not Lovecraft just being paranoid and racist about immigrants. Uncanniness presents a world in which our perception of reality clashes with the true nature of the world, where what we know to be real and true is challenged and undermined, but crucially, never quite conquered. It just changes and expands. Whilst Myhouse.Wad has a spooky horror story attached and messes with your expectations in very clever ways, everything about it is stuff that's possible within Doom's basic engine and widely available editing tools. It just took someone with a different perspective to widen our understanding of what's possible, and while that can be an uncomfortable experience, it's ultimately a positive one. Both the upside and the downside of the uncanny is that we will, eventually, conquer even the most liminal spooks put in front of us, bringing them into our sphere of comfortable understanding. But, in the process, we'll reveal new uncanny frontiers of stuff just outside the limits of our comprehension once again. The more we experience art, and the more it's able to surprise us, the more we can learn about the medium, and the deeper our understanding becomes. And that's especially important for video games, because unlike everything else, all games are uncanny, forever occupying a superposition of real and fantasy, known and unknown, their true nature forever just out of reach, including the stuff we'd rather not think about. Happy Halloween! Wait, what? Has it already happened? Ah, shit, you fucking kidding me? Yeah, sorry about that. I guess I was too slow. Alright, my bad. There's a spooky late Halloween rising from the dead! Whoa! Well, hi and welcome to the After the Video segment. That part of this very spooky episode-ish, where I resurrect the video to do my dark bidding, which is to say, talk about some cool things that I'm going to force you to pay attention to until you click the next video button on YouTube. Please don't do that, by the way. The first thing I'd like to promote is Lost in Cult, a producer of a variety of fantastic physical books, all stuffed with video game design observations and lovely art. They make everything from compilations of mini essays on a variety of games, to books dedicated to the art of some very pretty titles that I've covered before, like Sable and Citizen Sleeper. Seriously, these things are lovingly produced and there's so much passion and cool stuff in every single one, please give them a look. I am actually a little bit conflicted on that subject about shouting out Lost in Cult, because they were on my list of shoutouts for ages, and then they tried to pay me, and I don't do paid promotions, so I guess instead I am just going to do it for free because I have more integrity than sense. Although, if you do want to feel like you're supporting me, I might be writing a little something for their latest book all about video game haunted houses, so why not give that one a little look and maybe a pre-order? Yeah, why don't you? That sounds good. Alright, cool. Next, I would like to give a shout out to my wonderful patrons. Over the past year or so, I've been dealing with some personal mental health stuff that's really taken a bit of a toll, and one thing that's been a real lifeline throughout all of that has been the existence of my Patreon as a consistent income stream, and that's meant that I didn't need to burn myself out rushing out video after video and making things even worse. I am eternally grateful to them for their consistent support, and in return, it's the least I can do to offer them stuff like early video access, behind the scenes stuff, bonus content, and all manner of other things. If you would also like to support the channel and get some of that stuff too, please follow the link in the description. Yes, I know the Patreon redesign looks fucking awful, I hate it too. Speaking of all manner of other things, my top tier patrons, those most worthy of my love and respect, they get a special shout out at the very end. If you would like to join them, simply donate between $5 and $10 a month, and you can join the illustrious likes of these cool people, who are Ali Wright, Andrew Lebrano, Asaran, Alno94, Brennan Spalding, Brian Natariani, Buy More Skyrim for Todd, sorry about getting your name wrong so many times, my bad, Constantine Amend, Cool Jam, Cosmix360, Daniel Metjes, Das Kangaroo, David Setzer, Dirk Jan Karambeld, Digletier, Ekton, Edward Franklin Woods, Eugene Bulkin, Gazcol, IFR93, ISAW Dano, Jacob Dylan Riddle, Jinkaloid, Jordan Gear, Kevin Help Us, Luke Kokoran, Mace Window 54, Marika Vladilina Altair, Mark Vallant, Nate Graff, NWDD, Oliver Marhofer, Patrick Romberg, Peter D. Tomasic, Reddidex, Regal Regex, Revelation, Ray's Dad, Steam Rollerman, Steve Riley, Ty Gurin, Tyler Duncan, Uprising, Whimsical Wisp, Zach Brandmeier, and ciao. Okay, thanks for watching. I must now return to my endless slumber beneath the sea. Bye!